Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another podcast hosted by the City Bar Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies. My name is Jerome Walker, and I'm a co-chair of the task force. Today's podcast will focus on President Trump's January 23rd, 2025 executive order titled Removing Barriers to American Leadership in Artificial Intelligence. The fact sheet released by the Trump administration emphasized that President Trump's executive order revokes President Biden's executive order on artificial intelligence and requires the federal government and departments to revise or rescind all policies, directives, regulations, orders, and other actions taken under President Biden's executive order on artificial intelligence that are inconsistent with President Trump's executive order. Apparently, President Trump felt that President Biden's executive order hindered AI innovation, imposed onerous and unnecessary government control over the development of artificial intelligence, and established unnecessary burdensome requirements for companies developing and deploying AI that would stifle private sector innovation and threaten American technological leadership. The fact sheet also stressed that President Trump believes that his executive order would establish the commitment of the U.S. to sustain and enhance Americans' dominance in AI, to promote human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security. Make American development of AI systems free from ideological bias and engineered social agendas, and finally help the U.S. solidify its position as the leader in artificial intelligence and secure a brighter future for all Americans. Unlike President Biden, who favored a whole of government approach, President Trump has directed the Assistant to the President for Science and Technology, the White House AI and Crypto Czar, and the National Security Advisor to lead the effort to develop an AI plan to sustain and enhance Americans' dominance. To make sense of this, I'm very pleased to introduce three members of the task force who have worked with President Biden's executive order on AI and have turned their attention to President Trump's executive order on AI. These leading practitioners represent stakeholders across a broad range of areas and have experience in, among other things, AI and national security, AI and the use of AI in the judiciary, and the international regulation of AI. Our panelists include Nikhil Aggarwal, a managing director at Deloitte in the Risk and Financial Advisory Unit, Harut Minasian, an associate at Paul Weiss, and Nichole Sterling, a partner at Baker Hostetler. First, Nichole, then Harut and Nichole, would you please introduce yourselves to the audience? After the introductions, I will ask Nikhil, Harut, and Nichole questions about the executive orders with a focus on having them help us understand President Trump's executive order on AI. Nikhil, would you please introduce yourself first?
Good afternoon, everybody. First of Jerome, thanks to you and the task force for inviting me to join this podcast. I'm a managing director at Deloitte in their anti-money laundering and economic sanctions practice, and I'm based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. My focus areas are data and analytics, and I work with financial institutions on deploying AI and technology tools to bolster their program effectiveness and efficiency. My earlier experiences include leading data and AI teams at IBM and several Tier 1 global financial institutions. Glad to be on this podcast.
Thanks, Nikhil. Harut, would you please introduce yourself?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Harut Minasian. I'm an associate at Paul Weiss, working in the firm's AI practice group as well as its litigation department. Before Paul Weiss, I was a judicial law clerk in the New York State Commercial Division and in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Texas. My experience with AI includes currently co-chairing the task force subcommittee on AI in the judiciary, as well as serving as the chair of an AI startup based in California.
Nichole, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, everyone. And thanks for inviting me to join the podcast as well. Nichole Sterling. I am a partner at Baker Hostetler. I'm based in our New York office, and I'm part of our digital assets and data management practice group, where I focus primarily on privacy compliance issues and also emerging technologies, primarily AI. Within that, I am also part of the task force and co-chair the subcommittee on the international regulation of AI, and have recently joined the newly formed Sedona Conference Working Group 13 on their steering committee, which is their AI and the law working group.
Before we turn to the substance of President Trump's executive order on AI, we need to level set the discussion and perhaps provide a primer on an important area of artificial intelligence. Nikhil, would you please explain how AI models work?
Great question to get us started. It is broadly defined as a collection of computer programs trained on a set of data to recognize certain patterns and make certain decisions without further human intervention. So the idea here is to apply different algorithms on the underlying data to identify patterns and to make predictions. So it's a fusion of the building blocks of data and algorithms, and the models are the output. Machine learning is a subset of AI and can be used to explain two important types of models. First, supervised, and second, unsupervised machine learning. So supervised learning utilizes labeled data to train models to predict specific outcomes. So, for example, from the historical behavior of a group of individuals, you know what is suspicious transactional activity and what is not, and you use this knowledge to predict future suspicious activity. Unsupervised machine learning works with what we call unlabeled data to discover patterns and relationships within the data without any predefined target values. So, for example, you have a set of 100 individuals. You find that 98 of them transact within a certain range. And then you have these two outlier individuals with high transactional dollars and frequent cross-border transactions. So the model will tell you that you have to do a deeper investigation on these two outliers. So in short, AI models are helping to synthesize data from varied sources to augment prediction outcomes and also to discover new patterns and connections.
Nikhil, you have a very strong background in the national security area. Would you please share a few examples of how these models are being applied in the national security area?
Absolutely. I'd like to share two examples of how AI models are being used in national security. The first example is from the cybersecurity world. So AI models are being used to detect and respond to cyber threats in real time by analyzing network traffic patterns, identifying malicious activity, and prioritizing the responses to potential breaches. So national security teams rightfully continue to worry about expanding attack surfaces. If a particular threat actor of interest has been identified, AI models can zero in on the network around this actor and identify both technical or human-based threat vectors. The second example is from the counterterrorism and the anti-money laundering world. AI models are helping us to identify potential terrorist networks by identifying anomalies in money flows and tracking suspicious activities. So, for example, the AI model can focus in on high-risk geographies and detect circular flows of money, with the funds being channeled back to the originator. The important thing to note is that from the investigation's lens, AI does the heavy lifting of the mundane tasks of data gathering. And what this does is that it enables the anti-money laundering analysts to focus in on the higher value tasks that they perform really well. These include things like, evidence-based decision-making and zeroing in on emerging risk typologies. So clearly, AI models are having a huge impact on the national security world.
Thanks, Nichole. Harut, I want to turn to you now. As you know, President Biden and his administration were very active on AI issues during President Biden's 4-year term, and the marketplace and stakeholders have adjusted to those efforts, and investors have made investment decisions based on those efforts. How do you think different stakeholders, different market participants should react to President Trump's executive order in the short term? By short term, I mean during 2025.
Well, as a general matter, I think they should mark their calendar for Tuesday, July 22, 2025. And why is that? Because that is the deadline by which an AI action plan, as the executive order calls it, is due to be submitted to the president. The executive order talks about an action plan, but it doesn't go into any details about what type of substance it would have, other than to refer to Section 2 of that executive order, which you quoted before, and I think it's worth repeating. So Section 2, which I consider the heart of this executive order, says that basically the policy of this executive order and of the United States is to, quote, sustain and enhance America's global AI dominance in order to promote human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security, unquote. That really reinforces the administration's goal in focusing on American global leadership in AI and competition. So, short answer, mark your calendar for July 22. The action plan may not be published by then, but it's something to place on people's radar because it's likely that the action plan would be more detailed than the executive order. Number two, I think the AI industry is likely pleased with the direction that the current administration is taking. I think this executive order lays the foundation for less regulation and emphasizes, as I mentioned before, American leadership in the global AI space. And I just want to focus again on the text of the executive order. So Section 2 talks about sustaining and enhancing America's global AI dominance. And it's to do that in order to promote human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security. So it looks like on the face of this executive order, the substantive goals are to promote things like human flourishing, economic competition, national security. And the method by which that would be done is through America's global AI dominance. Now take Section 2 and look at Section 1. Section 1 talks about how it's revoking certain existing AI policies and directives that act as barriers to American AI innovation, clearing a path for the United States to act decisively to retain global leadership in artificial intelligence. Again, the emphasis on competition, global leadership. And then looking at Section 5, which talks about implementing a review plan in light of revoking President Biden's executive order. Again, reinforces those Section 2 goals. So when I look at the text of that executive order, and I compare that with the Biden AI executive order, which came out on October 30, 2023, I think what we see is two very competing values here. The Trump administration is focused on competition. The Biden administration, I think, was focused more on safety. This ties in, I think, with another stakeholder, safety advocates. I think safety advocates are likely concerned with the direction that the administration is taking. For example, the Biden executive order talked about ultimately implemented red teaming, public-private partnerships over safety. Under that administration, there was a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that was implemented. And basically, under this administration, at the moment, because there are still things in the works, much of that is kind of being put to the side for now. So I would say those are the likely reactions from some of the stakeholders.
What should lawyers be advising their clients on immediate short-term actions that clients should take to protect their AI operations and investments in response to President Trump's executive order, especially since investors, stakeholders had already put operations in place that took into account the Biden policies and guidance and administration, and President Trump's executive order is rescinding or revising that where it's inconsistent with competition and commerce, which is what you laid out?
Well, first, as a big picture matter, the executive order is more, at the moment, more aspirational and kind of just kicks off a process. It's hard to tell right now what specifically clients should be doing relative to that executive order. But over the coming months, we'll have a clearer picture about what that looks like. If there's any prediction, it's probably going to be that less regulation and more focus on competition. One important thing that's important not only for clients, but also for lawyers to be paying attention to is that they need to be following state and federal regulatory developments, I would say daily. It can't be a monthly check-in, especially in this space. And that's for two reasons. The first is that technology is developing rapidly. But second, the regulatory response, the potential regulatory responses are also moving quickly. I mean, if you go online and you type in deepfake legislation, there's a nice chart by the National Conference of State Legislatures, and it has all these bills that have been proposed or enacted just on that one topic alone, just deepfakes. So I would say right now it's a little hard to tell relative to this executive order, but the focus is going to be on competition. People should be paying attention daily. And as I mentioned in the beginning, mark your calendar for July 22.
Today's podcast is brought to you by one of the over 150 City Bar committees. If you're a City Bar member and want to become involved with work like this, with creating programming on cutting-edge topics, with shaping public policy, or to build relationships with professionals in your practice area, join a committee today by logging into your City Bar account at nycbar.org and clicking Join a Committee.
Nichole, Harut has covered the short term. Would you please focus on the long term by discussing how the marketplace and stakeholders should plan for President Trump's 4-year term? So not just 2025, but the entire 4-year term. What's the strategic approach stakeholders should take to protect their existing operations and investments and thrive going forward?
Yeah, so coming at this really from a global angle or an international regulatory angle, I think the one thing we really have to look at is that AI development is not a US-centric issue. We may, at this point, still be leaders in the AI race, although I think there's probably some other countries out there that are gaining ground quickly, and we've seen that happen just in the last month. This is constantly changing. And so I think that simply deregulating and following a sort of deregulation stance in the US is not where the rest of the world is likely going to go in this space. And so I think especially for companies that are developing AI models that they plan to market outside the United States, that this becomes an issue because, again, we have a tension there between things like the EU AI Act, which we could say in some and maybe many ways is over-regulation of AI, which is an argument that has been made. And even recent statements from people within the EU government have said that they are looking to potentially pull back a bit on the regulation of AI. So I do think that is still setting the bar. And I think that in the absence of real alternatives to that, that we will continue to see laws sort of take shape in the form of the EU AI Act, which we're already seeing with laws now in that have been proposed in places like Brazil and South Korea that, although not identical, are really sort of following the model that's been set out by the EU. In some ways, I think that the prior EO, the one that we had under President Biden, set out a sort of moderate regulation plan compared to at least that of the Europeans that gave us at least an opportunity, I think, to develop an alternative, a real alternative to what we have seen coming out of a heavily regulated area. And I agree with Harut that we're going to continue to see the states sort of picking up in this space too. So just because we have this executive order at the federal level that says you do not have to do X, Y, and Z, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can successfully function in the marketplace over the course of the next 4 years without having a plan for compliance with a lot of other laws that are out there and a lot of other laws that are likely to develop. And I think the other piece of that as well is that the executive order is really aimed in many ways at developers of AI and not at those companies that are using it, the deployers as they've come to be called. They still have to comply with a lot of legal obligations, and they're not going to be able to use AI that is not trustworthy, that cannot meet certain standards, which may mean that market pressures end up sort of forcing regulation in a way that an executive order won't in this way. And I just also wanted to pick up on the safety issues, which I think are interesting as well, to see kind of how those sort of unfold. This administration's executive order has really pivoted away from things like ethical AI practices and what have come to be seen as sort of these core safety issues, which are misinformation bias, and then certain aspects of things like representation, inclusivity of AI systems. But this also doesn't sort of take into account all the other safety issues that we look at within AI systems, such as, resilience, proper functioning, security, all of these types of issues, which are getting, I think, a little bit lost in this sort of hard pivot that we're seeing from the new administration on AI currently.
What role should lawyers play in helping stakeholders adjust to President Trump's executive order with a focus on the next 4 years?
I mean, I think a lot of it is helping them figure out what's going on and what they should be paying attention to. There is, as we know, this is our second Trump administration. We know that this tends to be, compared to other types of presidents, a noisier administration, I guess, for lack of a better term. There is a lot that's going to be coming out. There will be a lot that is said. And I think that lawyers are really critical in helping to figure out what is it that stakeholders and others need to really be paying attention to, like what matters to their business model or to what they're doing. And how does that interplay with laws that they also have to comply with? Because there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of pieces of AI that fall under other types of protections like civil rights, safety, employment protections, IP protections. There's a lot out there that this AI sort of crosses into. And so the executive order, while it has a lot that can potentially come out of it, is still bound by a whole lot of legal elements, I guess, all around it. And that's a place that I think lawyers can be really valuable, especially for the clients and others that they are working with. And then I think there's just a lot of like common sense steps that we've seen a lot of companies starting to take that we can't necessarily say stop taking those. And a lot of those are things that are built into existing governance programs and compliance programs that companies have internally. Things like AI transparency, testing your AI. If you're getting AI from a developer, are you testing it to make sure that it functions, that it does what you want it to? Like those are things that companies are not just going to stop doing. They do not want to invest in tools that aren't going to work. So those things will continue to happen, and due diligence is a big driver there as well. And I think a lot of lawyers are already advising in the information governance space, the compliance spaces, and there's really a lot of work that can still be done to help stakeholders figure out you don't need an entirely new AI compliance or governance program, but how can it fit within what you're doing, and how can you best achieve your sort of company's goals with AI? So I think those are a couple of places that over the next 4 years, lawyers can really bring value.
Nikhil, you, in a prior response, gave some examples of how AI would be helpful in the national security space. And I want to focus on that and give you a chance to drill down even more and expand the discussion. So among the purposes of the president's executive order are to encourage and accelerate AI innovation and, quote, to protect the national security of the U.S. Would you please explain how market participants should think about the use of AI to help address such national security issues as anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism and economic sanctions compliant?
Absolutely. First off, I did want to acknowledge the point that Nichole just made in terms of both AI developers and deployers. Both play a critical role, particularly when it comes to encouraging and accelerating some of that innovation. So let's talk through two examples, where we've really seen the game being changed. The first is the emergence of graph-based machine learning in AML. And what this is doing is it is helping us shift away from that two-dimensional spreadsheet analysis that investigators in the AML world have always been focused on. Now, graphs and networks, we are really able to visualize how a customer is interacting with various parties across a broader canvas, a broader network. Now, within this network, you may find that some of the parties are actually bad actors, and various graph algorithms identify out these bad actors, and you're potentially able to expand out the investigation to cover these broader cells that are showing up as potentially being involved in a bad activity. So what this approach is also doing is it's allowing investigators to better capture the relationships in complex corporate structures, particularly when you have headquarters in a particular jurisdiction and subsidiaries, in different parts of the world. And, when it comes to transactions, you want to be able to have a better handle in terms of the beneficial ownership. So the big win over here from that innovation lens is that cross-border activity can be more holistically captured using graph analytics. The second example, which is particularly important in terms of the CTF and the AML world, is on transaction monitoring. And I want to talk through this whole concept of this AI ensemble model. First, we know that the idea behind transaction monitoring is to proactively identify potentially suspicious activity. What this ensemble model is, it's really composed of several submodels, and these submodels are trained on a variety of algorithms. So, for example, we've spoken a bit about supervised machine learning, and we use this algorithm to generate out clusters or peer groups which have, very, similar activity. Some of these would be potentially anomalous. So you could have unusually high transaction dollars being structured into a series of smaller dollar transactions to stay below the thresholds that would trigger that suspicious activity. Another case is, when we speak about flows, transactors may be sitting in a particular jurisdiction, as in the originator, and now funds are flowing back and forth through multiple jurisdictions, some of them being high risk. And what you end up seeing is that the funds end up getting routed back to the originator, who in this case also ends up, being beneficiary. The other example would be in terms of supervised machine learning, and there's a technique called a random forest. That's an algorithm. And what this does is that it ranks suspicious activity based on historical alert dispositions. So we may be able to identify activity that is risky or not risky at all based on the outcomes of the prior investigations and all of the knowledge that we built up. So the innovation over here really is the fusion of these separate models. Each of them carries a separate risk signal, but all of this gets aggregated into an overall composite risk rating. And this would allow the AML program to have in place proportionate mitigating controls relative to the underlying inherent risk that these threats pose.
Excellent. So, Harut, when you were speaking earlier, you correctly pointed out that the focus cannot be just at the federal level because the states are responding in the AI space as well. So, the U.S. has a strong federal system and 50 sovereign states. And as you know, many states, including New York, Colorado, and California, have shown leadership in new technologies, including AI. Interesting, even New York City has a regulation in the employment context when it comes to AI. So how do you think the states will respond to President Trump's executive order? And which states do you think will show the strongest leadership? Do you think key states like New York, Colorado, and California will get in line with the direction set by President Trump? Or do you think those states and others will go in a different direction? What should lawyers be advising their clients on how to respond to the state's response to President Trump's executive order?
Personal prediction is that you're going to see states responding to the federal government by focusing on safety and privacy. Like I mentioned before, I think the big takeaway with this executive order is that it sets a tone about competition in comparison to the previous administration, which focused, I think, more on safety. If there's any takeaway, I think that's the big takeaway, that conflict between competition and safety. In terms of states that would be responding, I expect New York, California to be particularly responsive. For example, New York recently passed a law that regulates AI use within the state government. That law, it requires, for example, internal AI assessments, and as a default matter sets that AI can't be used for sensitive decision-making. It was related to whether someone receives unemployment benefits. A few months ago, California passed a slew of AI-related legislation. For example, the California AI Transparency Act, which requires qualifying providers to create AI detection tools for users. Assembly Bill 2013, which requires qualifying providers to provide a high-level summary of the data sets they use, including but not limited to sources and whether the data was purchased or licensed. Colorado is another state I would throw into the mix because Colorado recently passed the Colorado AI Act. And that act, among other things, basically establishes a duty of care on developers of high-risk AI systems to prevent algorithmic discrimination. It requires deployers of high-risk AI systems to create risk assessment reports describing a system's purpose, intended use cases, and other traits. So I think these states are going to be responding to the federal government's direction. Well, what that exactly looks like, of course, is unclear. For example, several months ago, California was considering this law that was considered very groundbreaking in terms of AI regulation. It would require reporting, et cetera, and that bill was ultimately vetoed by the governor of California. So there might be, for example, a push by some people, state legislators across the country, to have more intense safety-based AI legislation. However, there are also challenges that these approaches may face. So, for example, looking at risk assessment reports. A few months ago, the Ninth Circuit, in a case, Net Choice versus Bonta, ruled that a law that required online businesses to create reports that assess whether their online product or service harms children, and that also requires those online businesses to mitigate those risks, violated the First Amendment because it constituted compelled speech. So despite the state legislative efforts that are happening or may be happening, there will likely be constitutional challenges depending on the type of safety-related policies that are implemented. On a high level, I think the federal government and the states are going to be going into two different directions. And when I say states, I'm really referring to states like New York and California and the like. Again, one side is focusing on competition and viewing regulation as generally kind of a tying hands. And another side is viewing regulation as something that can lay a foundation for people to kind of have some level of certainty when it comes to whatever they're doing. Regulated entities having some sense of certainty about safety, et cetera. So I think that's the big challenge. In some, I would say it's really going back again to this safety versus competition paradigm.
Yeah. Okay. So, Nichole, let's focus on the competition element that Harut alluded to and the leadership element that is in the actual executive order. So many commentators, including me, believe that in many respects, some countries in Europe and some in Asia and perhaps South America, and certainly the EU, are ahead of the US when it comes to leadership in new technologies, including AI. Do you think the US is currently leading in the AI marketplace? Or do you think some of the countries, especially Europe, Asia, South America, and the EU, are ahead of the US? And what should lawyers be advising their clients, specifically the clients with international operations that have to comply with the laws across multiple international jurisdictions, on how to respond to President Trump's executive order?
I think the key thing is that you still have to comply with foreign laws if you're doing business outside the US. So you can't just comply with US laws and want to enter the European marketplace. Things like the EU AI Act, again, has a very broad jurisdictional scope. And those laws are going to affect businesses that are doing business in other places. In terms of AI leadership, I think there's sort of two questions there. One, it's the sort of AI sort of marketplace leadership, and I do think the US still holds a key role there as a leader. I do think other companies or other countries are probably gaining ground faster than the US would like at this point. And there are clearly some out there, for instance, China, which also has some fairly strict AI regulations on the books. Nothing that's a sort of comprehensive AI law, but they do have a number of AI laws that restrict different elements of AI use and development. So I think, it'll be interesting to see, we've seen such gains under, sort of the former administration's executive order didn't really seem to stifle innovation in a way. And the US was clearly still keeping up a leadership position. I think where the US is probably ceding ground on the leadership side is in the regulation space. And part of that has to do with the fact that if you're doing business in multiple jurisdictions, you're always going to end up building to the strictest requirements on some level, mostly because companies don't generally want to build multiple compliance structures within their company unless they absolutely have to. And I think AI and development of AI models in particular becomes one where it's very difficult to develop a model that works in the US one way and a model that works in another completely different way elsewhere. And in some ways, that sort of deregulation in the US may drive some sort of lack of trust from other countries where things are more heavily regulated and more transparent. I think that's one potential outcome. We could see something like the US becoming some sort of a beta testing ground for AI, where I don't know that's necessarily the case, but you could roll things out earlier here, fix the problems, and then release them, sort of elsewhere under different regulatory regimes. That's one thing that could happen. I mean, clearly there are already, for instance, under privacy laws, which is an area I spend a lot of time thinking about, ways in which companies are able to do certain things in the US and other things elsewhere and take different approaches. So that could happen. But I think, all in all, it's going to demand, I think, that companies really think about how they're going to tackle this, both from the development side, but also the deployment side. For instance, are you going to have employees in different locations able to access different tools and use them differently? Are they going to be subject to different employee policies internally about what they're doing? Will there be sort of multiple standards? We were already seeing some deviation, for instance, around high-risk AI, with the US taking a more sort of consumer protection approach to high risk and those systems that had kind of an immediate impact on people's lives in terms of making employment decisions, benefits, lending, that kind of thing, which the EU includes, because beyond that to sort of more societal harms as well. in terms of ways that they can be used for national security and the judiciary. So I think that there is some of that will have to just be dealt with. And I think that over the course of the next 4 years, we'll see some sort of leveling in the marketplace where the marketplace will almost have to compensate for sort of what is expected, especially with so many companies doing business across borders these days.
Nichole, I want to stay in the international space for a moment. And when you look at the January 13, 2025 executive order on AI, there's an event that occurred shortly before that is significant that I need you to explain to our audience. And in that respect, the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security released export controls on AI models. Can you shed light on this?
Absolutely. The BIS's new rule introduced one, new export controls on certain closed weight AI model exports, and two, a series of rules designed to restrict the international diffusion of large clusters of semiconductors necessary to train AI models. I'd like to focus on the first part and connect it back to the president's executive order by explaining the concept of AI model weights. So the building blocks of AI models are what we call variables or features. These are the data points used to make either a prediction or a classification, and choosing informative, discriminating, and independent features is crucial to producing effective algorithms. Now, these features can be aggravating or they can be exonerating. That's how they influence the final model. And what AI model weights really are, they are what we call numerical parameters that define the internal structure and the decision-making logic of a machine learning model. So these weights are initialized randomly when you're first training a model. And then as you go through these training refinements, the weights end up, getting finalized based on how they are modeled on the data sets. So the weights are really learned traits, and they control the strength and the direction of the signals. And these model weights, essentially what they do is they make sure that the model considers the most important part of the data more heavily. So features and weights are sort of the most elegant parts of an AI model, and it's vital for national security that these get protected and do not fall into the wrong hands. So an AI model can literally have millions of model weights depending on how complicated the underlying AI architecture is, and preserving and protecting these model weights is important since they define how the underlying model works, and any unauthorized modification could lead to unintended or malicious model behavior. So in short, these weights shape the performance, the robustness, and the capabilities of an AI model, and it should be crystal clear why the president's order, and at a broader level, why policymakers have and should continue to focus on these model weights.
Very interesting. So, Harut, earlier you were making observations that was essentially a comparison between the approach that was taken by President Biden and the approach that is taken by President Trump. And that is consistent with a lot of the commentary where there's some differences. On the one hand, some commentators have asserted that no new laws are necessary for AI because the existing laws are sufficient, or any new laws would stifle innovation. On the other hand, some commentators have asserted that new laws are necessary because existing laws may not, in some cases, do not cover AI. Some of those commentators have suggested either no new laws or very general laws based upon principles, not prescriptions. Who has the better position? And please explain your thinking on this issue.
Generally and currently, and I emphasize those words, generally and currently, I think pre-existing laws are sufficient. Much of the law is written in a technologically neutral way. And just a few examples to share. First, there was a consumer protection case from Canada from a few months ago, Air Canada case, where the plaintiff, he sued Air Canada because while he was using Air Canada's chatbot, the chatbot misinformed him and he detrimentally relied on that misinformation. And he filed a lawsuit claiming like negligent misrepresentation against the airline. And on a very preliminary stage, analogous to a motion to dismiss, the Canadian court said that, yes, in this case, he has sufficiently alleged a claim for negligent misrepresentation. And if you read that decision, there's a passing reference by the court in which the court suggests that the airline was arguing that the chatbot and the airline itself were two different entities. And the court rejected that point. And I shared this one out of their multiple consumer protection examples to show that the law here, I think, applies in a way where you don't have to create an AI-specific law. Another example is attorney regulation. There have been numerous cases over the past 2 years where attorneys have cited cases after looking for them through AI tools, and those cases are not real, and they have not gone out of their way to verify whether those cases are real. They submit it, and lo and behold, the court finds out that they are made-up cases, and they get in trouble. Mata versus Avianca from the Southern District in New York is probably the seminal case. But there have been numerous instances over the past 2 years. The Second Circuit in Parker versus Kim a few months ago, about a year ago, had a similar situation. Again, 2 examples. There are others out there, but these are 2 examples where pre-existing law neatly applies. But I did say at the beginning, I emphasize the words generally and currently. And there are instances where an argument could be made that we do need new laws. As to the point about currently, of course, the technology is changing and developing. And so down the line, the law may need to be updated, especially, I think, as AI becomes more agentic and more, quote unquote, intelligent. And just as an example, the more agentic that AI becomes, the more likely that there will be new issues related to principal-agent relationships. So, for example, you have an AI agent, you ask it to book a hotel for you. There are issues that can come up with that. But you can see how this can get very complicated. Just using that Air Canada case where the consumer relied to his detriment on a chatbot, imagine if the consumer, or the plaintiff in that case, relied on his own AI agent to go and then communicate with the airline's AI agent. And some misinformation happens along this chain of events. How would that change the analysis? Does there need to be a new legal framework that we should be thinking about? So I share that because there are some novel issues that I think are likely going to happen as the technology advances.
Excellent. So the next question I want to draw all 3 of you into this and get your take. So all of you have studied very closely AI issues with respect to case law where there are cases and where regulatory agencies have taken actions for including issuing guidance and enforcement actions, and how market participants have reacted to either case law or the regulatory agency guidance or enforcement actions, including in the context of national security, especially in the AML CFT space, where either the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network or the Department of Justice, or it could be local district attorneys and banking agencies, or it could be the Office of Foreign Assets Control that's gotten involved. And these could be banking issues, or it could be issues outside of banking. So, Harut, you in particular have conducted extensive research on how courts are using AI and how litigators or trial attorneys are using AI on matters that involve the judicial system. Indeed, you actually chaired a working group between the task force and the Council on Judicial Administration that issued a June 3rd, 2024 report titled AI and the New York State Judiciary, a Preliminary Path. And in that, you were particularly careful about getting ahead of the technology because you were concerned that the technology is moving so fast that if you take positions now, those positions may not be correct in a matter of months because the technology is moving fast. So would you please discuss that report and some of the important issues that lawyers should be concerned about when it comes to AI issues involving the judiciary?
And I also need to pause here and also give a special thanks to Jerome for your work in that working group as well. I'll repeat the title of the report because the wording there is very important. It's called AI in the New York State Judiciary, a Preliminary Path. And the word preliminary was our way to convey that, look, things are going to change and are changing quickly. So over the course of months, our working group did basically a months-long study to flag potential issues at the intersection of AI and the judiciary, particularly the New York State Judiciary. We contacted stakeholders, including federal and state judges, judicial administrators, private practitioners, and AI industry members. And the report really had three goals. First, to flag potential issues. Second, to propose some solutions. And third, to be a resource. And so some of the potential issues, not all of them, but some of the potential issues that were identified included, should lawyers be required to disclose to courts that they have used AI in their advocacy? Now, one side may argue, yes, perhaps it's a knee-jerk reaction, but it puts all lawyers on notice. Our working group's position was, no, we don't need to have such a disclosure requirement because pre-existing ethical rules would address concerns that motivate a disclosure requirement. Another issue, should judges use AI for decision-making as opposed to, say, summarizing text or legal research? Summarizing text, it's low stakes, easy to verify. When it comes to decision-making, well, the definition of decision-making in itself is a bit unclear. It's not clear-cut. And when it comes to any type of decision-making, there's a risk of automation bias, which is where people kind of defer to, let's say, technology, as an example, without verifying. Another issue, how should the judiciary as an organization incorporate AI? Some say it should go out of its way to buy AI products and tools because it has an easier path. Others say, well, it should go out of its way to build AI tools for internal use. The problem is that the judiciary doesn't have the resources that, say, a private company has in terms of building AI tools. And then how should judges learn about AI, particularly as it arises in their cases? Judges are generally generalists in their approach. Should they undergo mandatory training? Should they be learning as they go? The report touches on some options there.
Thank you, Harut. Nichole, you've not only closely monitored international issues in AI, especially how those issues might affect organizations with international operations, but you also practice in Luxembourg and New York. When you take into account how AI was treated during the Biden administration and its impact on the international regulation of AI, and you then take into account how President Trump plans to address AI issues, what are your thoughts?
Right. So I will say my time in Luxembourg predated AI, or well, not all AI, but the current AI issues at any rate. But I did get to spend my time there at the Court of Justice of the European Union. So it was, an interesting insight into how the European Union is functioning at that level. So I think that what I would like to pick up on here is really some things that I've already sort of hinted at or indicated on the way through, which is that I really think with the direction that the new executive order is going, that the United States is losing an opportunity to shift global AI regulation to something less rigid than the EU model. Because I think that in order to be able to do that, we need to offer a middle ground solution that would have been more aligned with what we were seeing under the prior administration. Because I do not believe the rest of the world is ready to accept a sort of deregulated AI space. I think also that President Biden's executive order really put value in international cooperation and stressed alignment with global standards and frameworks in a way that was really important. And the new administration's executive order doesn't really consider the world outside the US except to the extent that it's something to compete against. And I think that could be a problem in the long run. I think we're also currently seeing a lot of multilateral organizations working toward alignment on some of the key AI issues. For example, things like fairness, safety, and transparency. And if the United States is not tied into that, we continue to lose sort of influence in where the overall kind of global alignment in this space is going on. So I guess that's where I'm at, is that if the US continues to sort of focus on this deregulation of AI, while the rest of the world continues to sort of look elsewhere in its moves on AI, that we could really miss an opportunity to sway global norms and to be a part of that conversation that's happening.
So Nikhil, this brings us almost full circle. When we were talking about President Trump's executive order, I think it might have been Harut who alluded to the requirement to have an AI action plan. So that executive order, when it calls for developing an AI action plan, it calls for doing so within 180 days. Similarly, on February 6, 2025, the National Science Foundation, which took into account that executive order from President Trump, issued a request for information on the development of an AI action plan to define the priority policy actions needed to sustain and enhance America's AI dominance. And I want to put an emphasis on America's AI dominance. What are some of the considerations that could be incorporated into the AI action plan?
Great question again. And I do want to acknowledge Harut for bringing up the AI action plan. And I do want to weave in some of the points that Nichole has already made. The call for the action plan and the RFI present a tremendous opportunity to augment foundational AI frameworks and to enhance guidelines around several AI principles. And let's talk through some of these principles in terms of, demystifying them in simple terms. First, explainability. An explainable AI model produces details or reasons to make its functioning clear or easy to understand. The model being produced must intuitively make sense. Both the data scientists training the model, end users of the model, they should be able to sense check the model as it's being built out. The second principle is transparency, and Nichole alluded to this as well. Transparency refers to the clarity and openness with which an AI system's algorithms and decision-making processes are communicated, allowing both the users and the stakeholders to understand how the AI functions, how it reaches its conclusions. So it's important that we avoid what we call in the AI world black box models, where the inner workings are hidden and not understandable. The third AI principle that we really want to talk about is fairness. And what this does is it ensures that the AI systems are fair to individuals, regardless of their group membership. The aims over here really are to prevent the AI system from making decisions that are systematically biased against certain individuals. The fourth principle is robustness. And this is the ability of the AI model to maintain its performance and stability under different conditions, including variations in the input data to the model, environmental changes, any attempts at adversarial interference. Simply put, the AI model should not decay too easily. And finally, the fifth AI principle that we want to talk about is privacy, which is really the ethical use of personal data by AI systems. Now, this involves balancing the need for innovation with the protection of individual rights. We need to ensure that AI algorithms are not biased or discriminatory. So, as agencies receive the RFI responses, as they get responses to the call for action, it's important that while they're continuing to review relevant policies, directives, and regulations, they need to commit to and ensure that these AI principles are being layered in. That's really what's going to help us in terms of that path to dominance, stay on top of things and also stay aligned to some of the broader developments that are taking place globally.
Thanks, Nikhil, Harut, and Nichole, for addressing these particularly important AI issues and providing guidance to market participants and stakeholders. We look forward to your participation in the next podcast hosted by the task force. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Eli Cohen.